Good afternoon, Tevin.
Bernardo, welcome back. Welcome back to Mind Body Solution. How are you?
Good to see you.
Great to see you, man. How have you been?
Busy?
I can imagine. Uh, Bernardo, the last time we spoke, your video has been very engaging. A lot of people have been going back and forth in the comments section. It's been an intriguing journey to watch.
Cool.
I spoke to Sue Blackmore, I think it was last week, and I was thinking about the wonderful discussion you guys had, the theolocution with Kurt. How was that for you?
It was a while ago because it was published quite a while after it was recorded. I like Sue. I've met her in person a couple of times. So yeah, if you like someone, it's pleasant to talk. I don't think she's an illusionist at all. Because the way she defines illusionism is not what other people call illusionism. But other than that, I think it was a productive engagement.
It was amazing. The last time we spoke, we touched on so many different topics, Bernardo. We spoke about Carl Jung, Schopenhauer, mental health, psychiatry, life, death, religion, and to a point where I was trying to figure out, how do I approach this conversation? How do we do a part two that's engaging and that the listeners and viewers want to watch? And the conclusion I've drawn is, let's do a crash course on analytic idealism. And what inspired me was obviously your course with the Essentia Foundation. Brilliant course, well-structured. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about this approach?
Yeah, I'm game. Let's go for it.
I'm keen. And look, so I've broken it down into the 7 chapters, and I think we'll move from chapter to chapter. At any point I feel that there's anything I want to clarify or to provide some new content for the listeners, I think it's a great opportunity. And for you to also rectify or clarify anything you think you might have wanted to say and feel like this is the perfect opportunity. Do you want me to run down the 7 chapters for you, or do you just want to go step by step?
No, help me out. Give me the structure.
Okay, so the first question, we'll go through chapters. The first one will be investigating whether our ordinary intuitions about the nature of reality and the world at large can be true at all. Is the world really what it looks like on the screen of perception? Then on the... So do you want me to just break it down for you? You want to go...
No, let's do it one by one, so I don't have to push too many things to my stack before I start popping.
Okay, cool. Now then let's do it. I think, let's start off with that. Chapter 1. So this is a crash course on analytic idealism for all the listeners.
So the question is the world what it seems to be, in the sense that does the world contain these forms and shapes and entities and events that we discern on the screen of perception? And the answer is a categorical no. There are many things about analytic idealism that are sort of best guesses guided by reason and evidence, but other things are pretty established. They are just not mainstream yet. They didn't percolate up to the froth of culture. The world cannot be what it seems, in the sense that it cannot have those shapes and forms and events and spatial temporal positions that we discern on the screen of perception, because for the latter to be true, our inner states would have to mirror the external states of the world. But there is no a priori upper bound to the dispersion or entropy or level of disorder of the states of the world. We cannot decree that the world has an upper bound in entropy. So if we were to mirror the states of the world in our inner states, then our inner states would have no upper bound in their entropy. And therefore, perceiving the world could be deadly. You could melt into hot meat soup. Because your internal entropy has to be bound. Unbound internal entropy is not compatible with life. We would become soup, literally. So no, our inner states do not mirror the world. Another line of argument is evolution wouldn't have given us a perceptual apparatus that mirrors the states of the world. It would be confusing. It would be information overload. What we want is to be able to discern the salient aspects of the world in an encoded form that facilitates prompt responses to environmental challenges and also limits our internal entropy. So to summarize it all, the world as it is in itself is not physical, because what we call physical are the things we discern on the screen of perception, which are describable through physical quantities, such as length in centimeters, weight in kilograms, electric charge in coulombs, and so on and so forth. But these cannot be the way we would describe the real states of the world. These are descriptions of our internal cognitive representations, not of the states that they represent, the external states. So the real external states of the real external world are not physical in the sense that they are not describable through physical quantities. And then it raises the question, are there states that are not describable through physical quantities? Well, obviously, how many centimeters does your thought have? How many kilograms does your emotion weigh? What's the electric charge in coulombs of your depression, your fantasy? So what the prospect that it raises is that the external world is probably made of what we call mental states, experiential states. And the physical world is our cognitive inner representation of the real external states of the world.
Tell me, Bernardo, how aligned is this view with? Are you familiar with the work by Jude Currivan? And I mean, of course you are. You're not really, okay. But with Don Hoffman, I mean, you know that your guys' idealism theories are very similar. Of course, we spoke about this before, where you separate at the point where I think he takes conscious agents to be fundamental. So you need that human consciousness element.
No.
So is that not where?
No, Don doesn't say that. Humans are an instance of conscious agents.
Okay. Yeah. So fundamentally, when you think about the pioneers of this thought, because Don obviously wrote about the case against reality, and your work also describes, I mean, when you talk about the fact that we have this dashboard in terms of use the plane as a common example and measurement. Briefly elaborate on that, just for all the listeners who are not familiar with that analogy.
Think of an airplane. An airplane has sensors that measure the external states of the sky: air pressure, wind direction, humidity. In the case of a weather radar, it will pick up also all these elements, but in a more compound manner. So the airplane has sensors. Now, the results of the measurements that are performed by the airplane's sensors are displayed to the pilot on a dashboard. So the states of the dashboard represent the real states of the world outside. But the dashboard isn't the real world outside. That's obvious. Yet you can fly the plane without a transparent windscreen. You can fly the plane by instrument alone, because the dashboard conveys accurate information about the states of the world without being the states of the world. So the idea here is that our perception states, the colors we see, the sounds we hear, and the smells we feel, the texture on our skin, all that, these are dashboard representations of the real states of the world. We are airplane pilots that were born inside a cockpit without windows, and all we have ever had is the dashboard. And we've come to take the dashboard for the world, which is understandable, but not under the light of 21st century analytic philosophy and science, because we should know better now than to make what Donald Hoffman calls a rookie mistake, which is, in my metaphor, to take the dashboard for the sky. One represents the other. It doesn't mean that the representation is the thing represented.
Do you ever feel that there would be a way for us to get that dashboard to not be our main perceptive reality? Do you feel like we'll ever reach a point where we can actually see beyond into the true nature of reality? Whatever that is, whatever that means.
Mystics throughout history seem to claim that that is possible. It hasn't been possible to me. And I'm not sure about the analytic coherence of that claim, but I'm open to my ability to analyze things rationally to be limited. I mean, why would nature have to conform to the limitations of a monkey like me, a primate that has been running around with an intellect for only about 30,000 years? I mean, for all I know, it may be possible. I think, on the basis of reason and evidence and not spiritual introspection and insight, I think the dashboard is an artifact of life. The dashboard was constructed by evolution in the journey that life has undertaken on this planet. So if you don't want to have the dashboard on your way, that time is coming because you're going to die. And once you die, this dissociative process in the mind of nature that we call ourselves will no longer be dissociated, because life is what the dissociation looks like. If there is life, it means there is dissociation, because life is the representation. It's what that dissociation looks like. It's the extrinsic appearance of the dissociation. And the dashboard is an artifact of the dissociation, because the dashboard is the panel that allows you to have commerce from external states to internal states. But for there to be external versus internal, there has to be a boundary. Otherwise, everything is just outside, or everything is just inside, and there is no boundary, and then there is no dashboard. What is that boundary? That boundary is the dissociative boundary. It's a cognitive boundary enforced by the dissociative process we call life, because it looks like metabolism when represented on another dashboard. So the end of life is the end of that boundary, and therefore it's the end of the dashboard. And it's the difference between perceiving the world and being the world. So to be honest, personally, I'm not in a hurry to get rid of the dashboard. I'm okay if it takes a while.
Have you ever thought about why? I mean, evolution obviously provided us with these tools, hid the truth from our eyes in a sense. Why would you think that is the case? Do you think that there could have been alternative ways to do this? Do you think that there were other options possibly available?
Options to what?
To perceiving reality in a different way. I mean, because
I think every species has a slightly different dashboard. I don't think they are completely different because of convergent evolution. If doing things one way worked out very well for one branch of the evolutionary chain, chances are that other branches will hit upon that as well, and that will be fixed by evolution because it works well, and therefore things will converge. So I don't know that our dashboard, our screen of perception is the most optimal way to cognitively represent the external states of the real world. But if it's not that, it's not a bad way either. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking about it. So I don't think it's the only way. I think there are conceivably almost infinite other ways to represent the world. But it's a way that works. And I would expect that even other species will have similar dashboards, similar perceptual screens, but not identical, because it doesn't need to be identical. Bees see ultraviolet. There are species that detect infrared. Some species have sonic radar, and we don't have. What is it like to be a bat or a dolphin? So ours is not, it's certainly not the only one. This is certainly not the only way. But it seems to have been good enough for the past, since the genus Homo has been around, at 1.8, maybe 2 million years.
When you had, I remember, I think you once spoke about, I think you had one psychedelic trip. How did your dashboard change at that point?
Oh, I have had several psychedelic trips. In my mid-30s, I was writing about consciousness, and I thought it would be lapse to the point of irresponsibility to write about consciousness and not investigate consciousness through every avenue that we know to be safe. So I did several fairly high-dose psychedelic trips. I am in a country where it's legal, to the point that before I did my first trip, I went to my doctor and I told him what I was about to do and asked for him to check me up. So I had my liver checked, I had my heart checked, my blood pressure and all that good stuff checked, and I was given an okay, and here we go. I don't know whether a psychedelic trip is so overwhelmingly rich and intense that it's very difficult to make statements about what the causality behind what you are experiencing is. Where does that stuff come from? Is it from outside me? Is this my own stuff, my own shit, the skeletons in my own cupboard? Is it from aliens?
Mm.
Is it from another dimension? It's virtually impossible to say this. And to be honest with you, I don't think it's very important either, because the most baffling thing about a psychedelic trip is that it seems to be exactly what you need. And where it comes from is utterly unimportant, because the effect will be the same. So I don't know that psychedelics allow you to see the world, this world, as it is. Uh, could they do that? Yeah. I even suspect they might, to some extent, do. But even in that case, even if they do, to some extent, allow you to see our surroundings as our surroundings really are, and there's good reason to think that they might be doing that, because psychedelics reduce brain activity. So chances are that what is being reduced is, in fact, the dissociative process itself. The dissociative boundary is being weakened. So you're taking in things as they are, as opposed to representing them on a dashboard. But I don't think that's the only thing psychedelics do, or even the main thing, because if that were the main thing they do, we could die from a psychedelic trip, because the entropy of our inner states would be unbound again. You see? So I don't think that that's the only thing that is going on. And even to the extent that that is going on, I think it sort of gets mixed in with all kinds of other things. So it's impossible to make a statement that,
Mm.
oh, that particular experience, that was the world as it really is. I personally feel incapable of making that pronouncement.
Mm. I mean, so while sticking to this chapter's theme, I mean, on our intuitions and whether it is a true reflection of reality, when people do have these trips or make certain claims, whether it's religious, psychedelic trips, spiritual claims, and the way they link it to idealism, how do you feel that impacts the field of analytic idealism?
Spiritual claims in general. I don't have the delusion that I am, in some sense, owner of analytic idealism or even idealism. So what people make of it, it's their own personal freedom and their own personal responsibility, as long as they don't attribute that to me or attach that to analytic idealism as a pronouncement of analytic idealism. What they make of it in their own lives, I think it's their business, it's their responsibility, it's their lives. The way analytic idealism informs their lives is their own thing. So long as they don't attribute spiritual claims to analytic idealism itself or to me, I think it's okay. It's
Okay.
okay.
No. Okay, great. So, okay, we've touched on that. Is reality what it looks like? Anything else you want to touch on regarding our screen of perception and this nature of reality that you find on that? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's discuss then why mainstream physicalism in general fails on all key post-enlightenment values, such as coherence, internal consistency, parsimony, explanatory power, and empirical adequacy.
Okay, let's start with coherence.
Mm-hmm.
Mainstream physicalism is internally contradictory. Probably more ways than one. I will mention one. Physicalism will say we have these physical quantities that describe the contents of the screen of perception. So if I lift a heavy piece of luggage, I can describe that heaviness that I feel as 50 kilograms, or the lightness of a feather that I feel as five grams. So physicalism starts with the obvious. We describe the perceived world through physical quantities. This is metaphysically neutral and eminently reasonable. Galileo started doing this. But then physicalism makes a very weird step. It says, oh, those descriptions, those physical quantities, they precede the thing described. What really exists is not the feeling of heaviness that I have when I lift the 50 kilograms piece of luggage. What really exists is the 50 kilograms. And somehow my feeling of lifting it arises from the 50 kilograms, or is modulated by the 50 kilograms. And the same thing for everything else. What really exists are kilometers, joules, coulombs, seconds, grams, and so on and so forth. And the things that are described through these quantities they are secondary and they arise from the quantities. You know, that's eminently incoherent. It's like saying I can pull the territory out of the map. The map, which describes a territory, precedes the thing that is described. The moment you do that, your descriptions lose their semantic anchoring, because the lines on a map only have meaning insofar as you can link them to the territory. But if the map precedes the territory, the lines mean nothing. And that's what we call the hard problem of consciousness. We cannot derive the territory out of the map, because the map loses its meaning unless from the moment zero, it's semantically anchored to the territory. So to translate it into real life, we cannot derive the sweetness of eating an apple from the mass, charge, spin, momentum of the molecules constituting the apple. Of course not, for the same reason that you cannot pull Cape Town out of the map of Cape Town, because the map loses its semantic anchoring. The same way, mass, charge, spin, and momentum, if you say that they precede the sweetness of the apple, they lose their semantic anchoring. In other words, they mean nothing. And you cannot derive anything out of something that doesn't have meaning. So that was coherence. What was the next one?
Internal consistency.
Physicalism defines matter as that which has nothing to do with the qualities of experience, and then tries to explain the qualities of experience in terms of matter. Good luck with that.
I mean, that settles that. It is quite a tough one. I mean, it's, particularly knowing that mainstream physics has had so many different revelations over time, and each time we seem to be more and more confused by it. And knowing that matter is like 99.9 recurring percent, we just don't know what it is. There should be a clear indicator that we really just don't know what matter is.
The human psychology is such that the most obvious and self-evident bullshit gains an aura of plausibility if enough people along enough time tell you that it's true. That's human psychology.
That's very true. Okay, let's go into the next one. Parsimony.
The one ontological category that we absolutely know to exist because it precedes theory are the qualities of experience, qualitative stuff. That's how we begin. That's how we begin experiencing the world. That's how everything started. And then we started theorizing after that, but it begins with qualities. Now, the most parsimonious account of reality would be one that explains reality in terms of qualities alone, not only the qualities you experience or only the qualities that I experience, but qualities as a type of existent. If we can make sense of nature in terms of qualities alone, that's the most parsimonious, because it only grants existence to the one ontological category that we know absolutely surely to exist, because it precedes theory. Physicalism, however, postulates another one. Physicalism postulates another type of existent that's not qualitative at all, but can be exhaustively described in terms of quantities alone. Mass, charge, spin, momentum, geometrical relationships, and so on and so forth. That is only justified if you can't make sense of reality, account for the dynamics of nature in terms of qualities alone. If you can't, then okay, you postulate something else. But if you can, then postulating something else violates the principle of parsimony. And physicalism does that. All we need to account for nature is that there are external states beyond our individual minds, external qualitative states. Experiences that are not mine or yours. They are experiences of nature out there. These are real external states. But they can also be experiential, just like mine and yours. In the same sense that my thoughts are external to you, but they are still experiential states. If you were not around, I would still be having my thoughts. From your perspective, they are external and objective, but in their own nature, intrinsic nature, they are subjective and qualitative. So that's all we needed to explain nature, external, qualitative states. But physicalism conflates everything, and in postulating external states outside our minds, it thinks that those external states should also be non-mental, because anything outside our minds should be non-mental. Why? Why the hell? I mean, my thoughts are mental, but they are outside your mind. So from your point of view, if I tell you, well, the black holes black holes are made of experiential states, it's entirely analogous to my thoughts being experiential and outside your mind too. So that's a grotesque violation of the principle of parsimony.
Yeah. But the last two are explanatory power and empirical adequacy. I mean, and a part of it, I mean, I wanted to ask you about certain things like the observer effect, or perhaps even the Big Bang, and how we explain all of these using this concept now and understanding it differently.
I'm not sure what people mean by the observer effect.
Yeah, because there has to be an observer and it has to be separate at that point.
I don't know how to map it to the technical aspects of quantum theory, what people refer to as the observer. There's a measurement problem. That's probably what people mean by the observer effect. I don't know. Okay, so why is physicalism then not empirically adequate? Physicalism assumes that what really exists are physical states. In other words, states that can be exhaustively described through numbers or quantities alone. And we call those states strictly physical states. If physicalism is correct, then physical states or physical entities or physical properties have standalone existence because they are supposed to be the bottom level of reality. All states, such as mental states, are supposed to arise epiphenomenally from physical states. But what really has standalone existence, in other words, states that do not depend on anything else to exist, those are physical states. Physical entities do not depend on anything non-physical to exist. They do not depend on processes to exist because physical entities are the bottom level of reality. Experiment contradicts this. There is a series of experiments which had been going on about 45 years, and each won the Nobel Prize in Physics last year, which shows that if you have two particles, physical particles that are entangled, and you shoot one at the speed of light in one direction, and you shoot the other in the opposite direction, and then after a while, let's say scientist Alice makes a measurement on particle A, and at the same time, scientist Bob makes a measurement on particle B, and Alice and Bob do not talk to one another, it turns out that what Alice chooses to measure about particle A determines what Bob sees when he looks at particle B. How can this be? If particle A and B are fundamental, if they have standalone existence, they should be whatever they are, irrespective of what Alice chooses to measure. Right? Measurement is supposed to merely disclose what the particle already was immediately prior to measurement. That's not what turns out to be the case. Alice's choice of what to measure, technically, for instance, the axis of angular momentum, in which you measure angular momentum, that choice by Alice determines 100% what Bob sees when he measures particle B. How can particle B change and be something different because of what Alice on the other side of the universe chose to measure about particle A? So what this is telling us is that physical entities do not have standalone existence. Physical entities are a product of measurement. They arise from measurement. The thing that is measured, the state that is measured in the first place, isn't physical. It can give you a metaphor. Suppose you love football, but you can't go to the stadium. So you buy two television sets and you put them in your living room and you watch the match on both televisions at the same time, but on different broadcasters. Now assume that each broadcaster has their own cameras in the stadium. So the images on the two televisions will not be the same because they are produced by different cameras, but they will be completely correlated because they are images of the same football match. Now, if a time traveler from the 19th century were next to you watching this in your living room, the time traveler would be discombobulated, flabbergasted. How do the little man inside the box to the left can run exactly in synchronicity with the little man inside the box to the right without communicating? The boxes are separate. How do the little men on the left know what to do based on what the little men to the right are doing? The mistake our time traveler does is to confuse the appearance, the image of a phenomenon, the representation of a phenomenon for the phenomenon itself. The time traveler thinks that there are real little men inside the two boxes. He doesn't understand that those images are just that, images of something else, of a reality. But that reality is in the stadium. What you see on the television are just appearances thereof. And the appearances are synchronized because they are both appearances of the same thing. Now, what the Alice and Bob experiment tells us is that what Alice sees and what Bob sees, the particles they measure, they are the images on the television screen. And Bob's measurements are completely correlated with Alice's measurements, just for the same reason that the images on the two television screens are correlated with one another. In other words, the particles are not the thing in itself. The particle is the appearance that arises upon measurement when the cameras shoot a frame in the stadium. That's why they're synchronized. They are both frames of the same underlying reality. And the clue that that's underlying reality is the same is the word entanglement. And we have to part with this notion that when we make a measurement and we see a particle, that the particle was the thing measured. No, the particle is the image on the television screen. The thing measured isn't a particle. It isn't physical. It isn't exhaustively describable through physical quantities. It is almost certainly a mental state, not in your mind or my mind, a mental state out there in nature at large.
I mean, you spoke about entanglement, and I'm just thinking about, you mentioned that Nobel Prize, and when you think about Nobel Prizes, they're usually given to settled sciences. So when something is settled, you get the prize. I was just discussing the other day how Einstein never got the Nobel Prize for relativity, rather for the photoelectric effect, rather than that. But more and more, there's a growing body of evidence that seems to be showing us just how true this non-locality actually is. The fact that something that happens here can happen 12.8 billion light years away. How do you feel that these new physical data, we'll call it physical data for now, actually provides more evidence for your claim rather than for the physicalists out there?
The Nobel Prize tends to be given to discoveries that have meaningfully and positively impacted human life. So that's something to keep in mind. Even the Nobel Prize last was given to those scientists because of quantum communication and quantum encryption. So in other words, it tends to focus on the applications rather than the raw theory, which is one of the reasons why there is Nobel Prize in mathematics. You wait until it's applied by engineering, and then you get a Nobel Prize in engineering or physics, and then you get a Nobel Prize somewhere else. In mathematics, there is the Fields Medal, which is something different, but just as important. Look, there is no question that these new scientific results, which are not only in foundations of physics, like we talked about, but also in the neuroscience of consciousness. We've known for 10 years now, and this result has been repeated ad nauseum, that psychedelics only reduce brain activity. They don't increase brain activity anywhere beyond measurement error. That's also not what physicalist intuitions would expect. There is no question that these results are not what the physicalist intuition would expect. But what happens is, and this is nothing new, this has been the case throughout the history of science, and if you want to know about it, read a wonderful little book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, written in 1969, I believe, the third edition, which is the one you should read. What's happening now is what has happened many times before in history. A certain metaphysics, a certain worldview, a certain paradigm, which is the word used in that book, resists evidence that contradict it. And it keeps on resisting that evidence until it becomes completely untenable. And so there are two conditions. One, it becomes completely untenable. You run out of excuses. And two, you have to have an alternative that is viable. You never abandon a paradigm or a metaphysics or a worldview just because it is untenable. Human psychology sticks to what it knows is untrue until it has an alternative that looks more appetizing.
Mm.
So these two conditions have to be fulfilled. And the alternative cannot be something that you find in a book after you devoured an enormous library for 10 years. It cannot be hidden. It has to be in your face. It has to be talked about. It has to be known. It has to be common knowledge in a culture. Analytic idealism, or idealism in general, has not achieved that status yet. There are a surprising number of academics who do not understand idealism. They mix it up with solipsism. They mix it up with the pan-experientialism. It's a catastrophe of ignorance. So that first criterion is not yet met, but the second one is also not met, which is we haven't run out of excuses yet. And our tolerance for absurd excuses has increased a lot because of science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
We have become trained by mainstream science fiction to completely abandon our natural sense of plausibility. Think of series like Black Mirror and stuff like that. You know, you can upload your consciousness to a computer, and I mean, egregious nonsense. Or the Everettian view of multiverses. There are many multiverse theories, some of which are quite reasonable, but this particular one is egregious as well, which is, no, the way we explain how Alice and Bob's measurements are correlated is that everything that can happen actually does happen, just in a parallel universe. Yeah, congratulations. You just found a way to accept anything, any kind of bullshit that doesn't violate first principles can now be accepted on the basis of this. But look, from the moment my mouth started open when I said the last word, countless gazillions of physical universes as big as this one have popped into existence out of nothing for no reason, for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. I mean, we now accept this as plausible.
Yeah.
Now, there are YouTube videos from respectable channels like Veritasium that say, well, this is probably true. I mean, you have to hang your rationality at the door when you come into a room before you say that. But we have legitimized nonsense through science fiction, which has given enormous scope for excuses. So it allows people to say, well, those experiments that just won the Nobel Prize, they don't mean actually that physical entities do not have standalone existence. You know why? Because there are these hidden variables in nature that are global. They are spread across space and time. They're everywhere. And they do exactly what needs to be done for us to continue to believe in physicalism. Oh, but how? Oh, we have no idea. Okay. What are those hidden variables? Can you at least theoretically define them? No. We define them in terms of what they need to do so we can continue to believe in physicalism. Is there any evidence for these hidden variables? No, not an iota. Yeah, okay. I mean, this is worse than religion. This is, it's much worse than religion, because in religion, you at least are basing your faith in some state, like your intuitions. You're basing it in some state, in something that comes across as substantial in some way. But this is based on nothing. This is based on trying to make nature fit your theory, as opposed to making your theory fit nature. Unfortunately, this is widespread. So we are nowhere near running out of excuses, because we've grown in our culture to accept tremendous implausibility as something that may be the case. It's probably true. Multiverses, it's probably true.
Multiple worlds theory. Yeah, there's a lot of those. Okay, so chapter 2, I think, look, so physicalism, we've concluded, we've spoken about why that fails on all those post-enlightenment values. Anything else about physicalism you want to touch on, Bernardo? Anything else you can
Let's go.
Yeah. Chapter 3, right. Let's investigate now. We'll move on to the next one. I mean, this one is something I know you're very passionate about talking about as well. Let's investigate the insoluble problems of constitutive panpsychism. Fashionable metaphysics that postulates consciousness to be a fundamental property of matter.
But let's first look at the differences. What idealism says is that everything is mental states. Not your mental states alone or my mental states alone, mental states at large. Everything's a mental state. Physical states are representations of mental states upon measurement. But even the physical states are mental because the contents of the screen of perception, the things we see, hear, touch, feel, they're experiential as well. Mm-hmm. So we have mental states representing other mental states. All there is mental state. Matter is a mental representation of other mental states. Panpsychism is not like that. Panpsychism says what really exists is matter. And matter has physical properties that are not mental, such as mass, charge, spin, momentum. But in addition to having physical properties, matter also has mental properties that are fundamental and irreducible. So mass, charge, momentum, and an experience. Still, an experience is now seen either as a property of matter or as the intrinsic nature of matter. In this latter case, it comes closer to idealism, but not much, because even if experience is the intrinsic nature of matter, the structure of reality is still the structure of matter, the structure we perceive on the screen of perception. In other words, reality is still made of tiny little particles that come together to form bigger physical arrangements and bigger consciousnesses, because the mental states somehow are supposed to combine with one another until giving rise to what it feels like to be us. Mm-hmm. A combination of the mental states of every subatomic particle in our brains, something like this. So constitutive panpsychism is different from idealism. Now, why is constitutive panpsychism obviously wrong? There are many reasons. I'll mention one reason, and then I'll try to dissect the intuition behind panpsychism, so you even drop that motivation to begin with. But first, one empirical reason. Panpsychism assumes that at the bottom level of nature, according to modern physics, there are subatomic particles. In other words, discrete little building blocks with spatial boundaries that form structure by the way they either split apart or come together. This is incredibly naive. This would have been acceptable in physics up to the mid-1920s, but by the late 1940s, we've known better. When physicists, and by this what I mean is high-energy physicists or theoretical physicists working foundations of physics, because you have solid-state physicists and applied physicists, applied physics guys, and they tend to make the same mistake. Because it's a model that works in practice. Let's think of nature as gazillions of little bricks. But we know that's not the case, because since the advent of quantum field theory in the late 40s, well, that was quantum electrodynamics by Feynman, and then that was extrapolated not only to electromagnetism, but to all the other families of particles. So now we have quantum field theory. We know that what we call particles, we use the word as a metaphor. Particles are like ripples, excitations of underlying quantum fields. A ripple on a lake can be characterized through physical quantities. A ripple has a certain height, has a certain speed, a direction of movement, a certain width and breadth. But that doesn't mean that the ripple is something other than the lake. The ripple is a doing of the lake. You cannot fish the ripple out of the lake. The ripple is something the lake does. There is only the lake. There are no ripples. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So in exactly the same way, there are only the quantum fields. There are no elementary subatomic particles. And yet we talk about the properties of elementary subatomic particles. Spin, charge, momentum. Yeah, just like the ripple has a certain height, speed, the direction of movement. It doesn't mean that there is anything to particles other than the underlying quantum field. There are only quantum fields, and they are not spatially bound. They do not have spatial boundaries. They cut across the entire universe. And this is true in very significant ways, because without it, we could not explain a great many things. For instance, we could not explain particle interactions, which is how I grew up. You know, my first job was at CERN. And CERN is about the experimental study of particle interactions. You use a collider to make particles interact. When particles interact, they produce other particles that were not part of them. For instance, when you produce a Higgs boson in the Atlas experiment at CERN, that Higgs boson decays into particles that were not part of the Higgs boson. And that's what we measure. You can never measure the Higgs boson. It decays too quickly before it interacts with any measurement surface. So one of the possibilities is that the Higgs boson decays into 2 muons, or heavy electrons. But the Higgs boson is not made of 2 muons. There aren't muons inside the Higgs boson. And yet somehow the Higgs boson, when it ceases to exist, 2 muons appear. And that's what we measure. How do you explain that? Well, you cannot explain it without quantum field theory, because the muon was a certain ripple, and that ripple decayed into 2 other ripples. And that's all there is to it. There was never Higgs boson. There were never 2 muons. There were patterns of excitation of underlying quantum fields, which decay and take on different patterns. A ripple can decay and become lower in height, longer in breadth, and reduce speed. That's why particles decay into other particles. Or another thing that you cannot explain without quantum field theory, unless you are prepared to accept magic, is quantum fluctuations. You know, the spontaneous appearance and disappearance of elementary particles in a complete vacuum. I mean, this is bloody magic if you think particles are little bricks. Little bricks, boom, pop into existence, and little bricks, boom, pop out of existence. No, that's not what's happening. What's happening are the unavoidable noise or the unavoidable excitation on the surface of a lake. If you look, even a very calm lake, if you look at it with a magnifying glass, you see there are tiny little ripples appearing and disappearing everywhere. The same thing on the fabric of reality, and that's quantum fluctuations. I mean, I could go on and on. There are no bloody particles. There are only fields. Fields are not spatially unbound. Therefore, insofar as constitutive panpsychism assumes very naively that the elementary building blocks of nature are particles, which it does for it to be able to work, it's just wrong. This is not a philosophical opinion. This is a scientific bloody fact. The whole thing is based on a surprising ignorance of, we could say, modern physics, but it's by now a century old. I mean, it's not even really very modern anymore. For the past 50 years, we've been trying to go beyond quantum field theory and fold gravity into it. I mean, that quantum field theory is right. I mean, it's the most successful theory in the history of mankind. So yeah, panpsychism is wrong. Now let's explore the intuition behind it. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, go ahead. I mean, this is literally your opportunity to do that.
Okay. The intuition behind panpsychism is that we are compound beings. We are made of discrete little cells, billions of them. Therefore, our minds should be compound as well. Our consciousness should also be made of a combination of gazillions of little consciousnesses. Our subjectivity should be made of the combination of gazillions of little subjectivities. Because after all, we are compound. So should our consciousness be compound. Ergo, constitutive panpsychism. Now, this makes all kinds of mistakes. The first one, which I would just mention without going in depth, is it mistakes the structure of what is represented on the screen of perception for the structure of the perceiver. It's like mistaking the pixelation of my screen for a pixelation of my subjectivity. Particles or elementary subatomic processes, they are the pixels of the screen of perception, not necessarily the structure of the perceiver. But you say, well, you are a perceiver, and if I would look at your body with a big magnifying glass, I would see that it's made of little pixels, little subatomic particles. No, my body is not my subjectivity. My body is the appearance of my subjectivity on a screen of perception. My body is itself a representation. It's what my subjectivity looks like on the screen of perception that we call the physical world. So that pixelation you're seeing is the pixelation of the representation of my subjectivity, not necessarily of the subject. So that's one error. The other error is more subtle, so I want to spend a little more time with it. It's this very notion that we are actually assembled together by a number of cells. If we look at a grown human body, yes, you'll find lots of cells. And then you may confuse it with a car, because a car is also made of parts. We are made of parts, cells. The car is made of parts. What you have to remember is how the car came to being and how a human being came to being. A car was assembled. Parts were brought together from different places and then welded together or bolted together to form a car. Our car truly is a compound entity. But we are not. We were not formed by gazillions of little cells crawling towards one another on the ground and then piling up on top of one another until, hey, here, a human being. That's not how it happened. We grew. We were not assembled. And if you look at growth, immediately after fecundation, and you know that, of course, better than most people are hearing, the egg, the fertilized egg, is a single cell. It's not a compound organism. It's one cell. 3 days later, it's 8 cells. But if you look at it, you realize that those 8 cells is just a linguistic way to say that the original zygote, or the original egg fertilized, developed inner structure. Our cells are not parts. They are a kind of self-similar or fractal inner structuring of the original zygote. In other words, I am still that zygote that was in the womb of my mother 9 months before I was born. It's just that that zygote got bigger and created internal differentiation in a self-similar way. So it started as a cell. So its internal differentiation has the shape of, guess what? Cells. Because it was a cell. It only knew how to be a cell. So its internal differentiation is cell-like. There's nothing really counterintuitive or surprising about this. We are as unitary and non-compound as adults as we were when we were a one-day-old zygote in the womb of our mothers. It's just that it's a big and highly internally differentiated zygote right now. We are not compound, so that very intuition behind panpsychism is wrong, because it naively presupposes that we were formed by gazillions of cells crawling towards one another and piling up on top of one another to make us. No, sorry, that's not how it worked. And the clue to it is that every cell has the same genome. That's the physical clue that we are not compound.
And tell me, Bernardo, why do you think it's on the rise the way it is? Panpsychism, that is.
Because we, as a culture, even amongst the elites, cultural elites in academia, I use this word in a rather pejorative sense. So I mean it pejoratively. I think this whole elite stuff is one of the biggest bullshits in the history of mankind, which doesn't mean that everybody's an authority on anything, but anyway, I digress. There is this sense in academia and in cultural elites that, you know what, physicalism indeed doesn't work. We are screwed. It's not going to go anywhere. Christoph Koch just lost his bet to David Chalmers made 25 years ago that in 25 years, science would have an account for experiential states or consciousness. Well, it doesn't. And it's not any further than it was before. In fact, things got worse. So Christoph will have to give Dave, I think, what was it? I think it was a case of wine. I forgot what the bet was. So there is this sense that there's this sense of impending doom for physicalism. But there is a very strong psychological need to see this process not as an error, but as a step in a kind of evolutionary path in which we are constantly getting things more and more right. So physicalism was a step forward, but it was not the final step. So now we have to take the next step by reusing the good parts of physicalism, namely that the universe is made of matter. But now we just add experience as a fundamental property of matter or the intrinsic nature of matter, and physicalism still sort of survives, and we have this warm, fuzzy feeling that, oh, it was not all for nothing, you know, we were not stupid, we just didn't see far enough, and therefore panpsychism now adds the ingredient that was missing, and merrily we go onwards. You know, it's a progression, it's not an error. That's the psychology underlying this. We want to hold on to as much as possible of what we used to believe, even after we realize that it will not deliver the child, that the child is stillborn. We still want to stick to as many aspects of it as possible in order to go to bed with that feeling that we didn't waste our intellectual lives. Well, this is complete nonsense, of course. This injects human subjectivity into what is supposed to be a rational, reason and evidence-based process. No, physicalism is just bloody wrong. And that's the end of it. We owe nothing to it. Science doesn't depend on physicalism. Science is metaphysics agnostic. Science is the study of what nature does, not what nature is. All scientific entities, theoretical entities, are convenient fictions. Nature behaves as though those entities really existed. Whether they really exist or not is irrelevant. We can still build mobile phones and put a spaceship on an asteroid, even knowing that Newton's laws of motions were wrong. Newton's laws were wrong, and we put an asteroid on this, a spaceship on the surface of an asteroid using Newton's laws of motion because things behave as though they were true. So these convenient fictions are the basis of both science and technology. We owe nothing to physicalism. The only thing we owe to physicalism is that less scientists died, burned at the stake during the early stages of the Enlightenment. You know, after Bruno was burned in 1600 in a central square in Rome, burned at the stake for holding scientific views, scientists realized, damn, we have to come up with a story here to say that no, we are working on something completely different from the church, and we are not a threat to the church. So what's this domain of the church? Well, the church is claims domain over a psyche, the Greek word for spirit and soul, but also mind. In Greek, in ancient Greek, there was no differentiation between mind and spirit and soul. It was all psyche. So, okay, that's the domain of the church. Let's invent another one that is not psyche, one that is not mental. And we will not burn at the stake. And lo and behold, it worked. And the problem is that the early figures of the Enlightenment knew what they were doing. Denis Diderot is on record saying, materialism, the old word for physicalism, materialism doesn't work, but we have to keep on using it as a weapon against the church. I mean, this is written, it's on record. They knew that. But at some point, with the bourgeois intellectual revolution of Darwin in the mid-19th century, intellectual elites figured not only can we survive the church, we can supplant the church. And drunken as they were in that time, they started believing their own snake oil. And they bought into physicalism. There were other psychological factors as well. You know, you get rid of hell, you get rid of the greatest fear of mankind, which is what will we experience after we are dead? That has been the greatest anxiety of mankind throughout our history. And in the mid-19th century, it was gone. I mean, this is fantastic stuff, right? And then we forgot that certain things were never meant to be truly believed. They were political tools. And now we believe that shit. Sincerely. Sincerely.
You you mentioned so many different things there that I want to touch on. I mean, I think the first thing that stood out, I mean, you mentioned Christoph Koch, and he lost that bet. I spoke to him quite recently, and I'm just thinking about if you were there when Francis Crick started this whole talk about the neural correlates of consciousness, what would you have said to him?
But Christoph, I regard Christoph very highly, and I tell you why. Christoph is sincere.
Yes.
He's not a politician. He's not trying to protect his image or his respectability or his grants. He is honest, he is sincere, and his view of things therefore evolves, because as he thinks more deeply about things, as he's exposed to more evidence, as he exposed to different ideas, he is incorporating all of that in his inner mental processes. Outwardly, of course, he will be cautious, because nobody in science or analytic philosophy wants to be co-opted by the nonsensical fringes. Nobody wants to do that. I run this risk more than most, because idealism has for so long been associated with religion and spirituality, even though that's not my angle on it. I run that risk, but I'm not in academia. I don't depend on grants. I'm pretty free to say what I really think. But Christoph, I think he's quite sincere. And the influence of Francis Crick on him was, of course, immense. Christoph was very young. Francis was already a Nobel Prize winner. Francis was beyond a Nobel Prize winner. I mean, he's the guy who discovered DNA. I mean, this is the Nobel amongst the Nobels. This is the Meta-Nobel Prize, right? And the guy was his mentor. I had a mentor too, Rudy Bach, who was a famous physicist at CERN. He was a father figure to me. I know what it is to be in the field of a mentor. And I don't know for a fact that that happened to Christoph, but Christoph is human just like the rest of us. I would be surprised if that hadn't been a factor there. So in other words, I am prepared to give Christoph all kinds of passes for because I believe in his sincerity.
Yes, no, he's
I believe in his honesty.
Yeah. And your thoughts on just general neural correlates of consciousness, anything you want to say about that?
I think it is undeniable that there are correlations between patterns of brain activity and inner experience. I just interpret that differently. Instead of thinking of patterns of brain activity as the cause of inner experience, I interpret them as the appearance of inner experience. In other words, brain activity is what inner experience looks like when it's observed from the outside. And this is not surprising. The appearance of a phenomenon correlates with the phenomenon it's an appearance of. I mean, right? So it's a different interpretation, but not a denial of the fact of the correlation. The correlation is there. And to do neuroscience, all you need is the correlation.
Yes.
Because an objective measurement of brain activity gives you an extrinsic appearance of what's going on in the mind of the subject. And that ought to be tremendously useful. So analytic idealism does not contradict neuroscience. On the contrary, it validates neuroscience metaphysically. You should keep on doing brain scans, because that appearance is what the phenomenon you're interested in looks like. You look at the image of a phenomenon to study it. There is nothing wrong. I mean, this is the essence of science. Science is we look at the image of a phenomenon. For instance, when I'm in my workbench here behind me and I'm using an oscilloscope to measure electrical activity, I don't think that that picture on the screen of my oscilloscope is the phenomenon. No, it's what the phenomenon looks like upon measurement. But that appearance is extremely useful. I use it every day. You know, the same thing for brain activity. You're looking at the appearance of the phenomena you're interested in, and that's science. That's legitimate. So I think looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, pay attention to the words, the neural correlates of consciousness, not the neural causes of consciousness, is incredibly valid. I think there is an issue that for a long time we mixed up the neurocorrelates of consciousness with the neurocorrelates of meta-consciousness. In other words, reportable experience, which is something extra on top of the experience itself. But awareness of this conflation is growing. And so now we will be adopting, say, no report paradigms to look at the true neurocorrelates of consciousness. And I'm all for it. I'm all for it. I think neuroscience is critical for a healthy future of the human species. And I am not skeptical of neuroimaging to the extent that others are, because those bugs were found in analysis software a couple of years ago, and people said, well, throw away 23 years of neuroimaging. I don't think that. I think some results are so robust that despite those bugs, many of the conclusions can still be said to hold. So I'm not antagonistic at all. What I'm antagonistic of is when a neuroscientist is biased and tries to fit or communicate his results in a way that makes it sound compatible with physicalism. That I think is dishonest. I think it's a lie. I think not only it defaces science, but it's immoral. And I think things like that should end scientific careers when they become public.
I think before we close off with chapter 3, which is
by the way, Christoph is guilty of none of what I just said. I had other people in mind.
Okay. Do you want to mention them, or should we just move on?
No.
Okay. Before
whoever pays attention to my output knows who I'm talking about.
Okay. I mean, we're closing off on panpsychism. Before we do that, we have to address the elephant in the room, which I think in this case has to be Philip Goff. Because the last time we had a chat, you mentioned Philip Goff and how he changes his views all the time, but we didn't go into it. So I think this is a perfect time to touch on that.
Oh, but that's cruel, because now you're inviting me to freely criticize a colleague.
I mean, Philip's a colleague of mine too. We've chatted as well. So this is not a platform for hatred or anything, but just more of a critique of his ideas.
Now, if you give me a specific point that I disagree with, a point that Philip makes and I disagree with, I'm prepared to argue why Philip is wrong. But if you just invite me to say, okay, now, no.
Okay.
Criticize Philip Goff.
Okay, not Philip Goff. Philip Goff's version of panpsychism.
It is a form of constitutive panpsychism, in which instead of saying that experiential states are a property of matter, he says experiential states are the intrinsic nature of matter. In other words, matter is experiential states, and physical properties are sort of epiphenomenal. So it comes very close to idealism in a sense, but not at all in another sense, which is it still attributes to consciousness the structure of matter. And that's the error of taking the pixelation of the image for the structure of the thing that is represented as an image. For instance, on your screen right now, I appear pixelated. Unless you are using an Apple Retina display, if you look close enough, you see that Bernardo on your screen is made of little rectangles. But that's the pixelation of my representation on your screen. Bernardo himself is not made of little rectangles. So when Philip says the structure of nature is the structure of elementary subatomic particles, he's making precisely this mistake. He's taking the pixelation of the appearance for the structure of the thing that appears. And he also makes the mistake, which was forgivable for him when he began, of taking elementary subatomic particles as irreducible things, while physics for the past 90 years or at least 80, knows that no, particles are just ripples of fields. What really exists are the fields. Now, I made this criticism to Philip years ago, and his response was to say, well, but there is one possible theory of physics which acknowledges that there really are particles, and that's Bohmian mechanics. Came out in a famous double paper by David Bohm in 1951, famous pilot wave theory, which is an interpretation of quantum mechanics according to which particles really exist as little things. But there is a reason why that thing was never taken seriously by the vast majority of scientists. There are many reasons, many of them technical. There is that Czech, or is it Slovakian? There's a Czech physicist, Mottl, I forgot, Lubos Mottl, I forgot his name, but he once wrote sort of the definitive criticism of Bohmian mechanics. He took the time to elaborate in every technical detail why that thing is just nonsensical. But an intuition survived because there was a famous experiment done many years ago with droplets on a fluid that was claimed to emulate the results of the double slit experiment, but with little droplets. In other words, physical little entities. But 3 years ago or 4, paper came out showing that those results were because of experimental errors. Those results were not valid. So even the intuition behind it, it's now gone. So Bohmian mechanics is history. It doesn't have a chance. And even if it had, it's such a niche thing that if Philip hangs the plausibility of his view on that, as he did a couple of years ago, then he might as well give up. Instead of going to Joe Rogan and other podcasts and talking about something that by now he should know is untenable. There's something else he should know, but apparently he's still talking about it. He says idealism is inflationary compared to panpsychism. And the reason is, he says, well, Bernardo, you yourself talks about mind underlying the physical world. So you have these two things, the physical world and mind, which makes me go like, oh my God, no, I would expect that from a podcast listener, but not from a professor. He is running away with language and failing to understand what is meant. Under idealism, mind underlies matter only in the sense that the thing that really exists is mind. And what we call matter is itself a mental process that represents mental processes. In other words, there is only mind. There aren't two things. The usage of the word underlies is just to cater to popular intuitions. You see a physical world. There is something that underlies that in the sense that the sky underlies the indications on a dashboard. But the dashboard and the sky are physical. The sky is not a separate ontological category. In the same way, the physical world is mental because it's an experience I have. And what underlies this mental process is another mental process that is represented by the first one. In other words, there are only mental processes. There's absolutely no inflationary approach here if you bother to think about it for 10 seconds and try to understand what is meant, as opposed to sticking to the mere word underlies as if it signaled ontological inflation. It doesn't, sorry.
So, Bernardo, before I wanted to move on to chapter 4 before this, but I mean, I have to ask you this question. I know because Philip and Keith now have the podcast Mind Chat. I mean, I love the fact that more people are chatting about this. We're getting into this a lot more in depth. What are your thoughts on that as a concept? Because I know Philip does say that if panpsychism does not work, the most reasonable theory that he thinks is second best is illusionism.
I think it's the stupidest thing in the history of philosophy. It's a completely self-defeating thing that only survives by making its own proponents very confused and all tied up in a conceptual web. So confused that at some point they squint their eyes and wave their hands and say, oh, and behind all that, that's the answer. That's how it survives. It's not a product of clear thinking. Let's first address it from the obvious perspective. We will go deeper because most listeners should believe that the proponents cannot be this drastically wrong, that they see a little deeper than this. So the obvious perspective is an illusion is already an instance of a conscious process. You experience an illusion. So you cannot dismiss the existence of consciousness by appealing to illusions, because illusions are already instances of that which you want to dismiss. So it's immediately self-defeating. If consciousness is an illusion, then consciousness exists. if every content of consciousness is an illusion in the sense that it doesn't correspond to external states of affairs, consciousness would still exist. And actually, it would be the only thing that exists because it's all illusion. So there is nothing else. There is only the illusion. Illusion is already an instance of consciousness. And then you might think, oh, but these guys with Ph.D s, they must see deeper than this. There must be something to illusionism beyond this, right? Mm-hmm. Not really, but they think there is. And I'll tell you what they think is there. What they say is the following. And this could be a paraphrasing not only of Keith Frankish, but of Danny Dennett, his master, as well. It goes like this. If my experiences are actually just brain activity, why do my experiences not look like firing neurons? If my experience is firing neurons, why do they not look like firing neurons? Right? If I experience the night sky doesn't look like firing neurons. Then the theory goes as follows. Oh, it's because the brain produces a kind of summary digest of its own activity. And what we experience is that sort of summary digest. Now, the summary digest is not the original brain activity, and that's why we don't experience things that look like brain activity, that look like firing neurons. It's because what we experience is a summary digest produced by the brain of its own activity and not the original activity itself. Mm-hmm. Does it sound reasonable?
It's difficult. It's difficult for me to say because, I mean, initially when I came into this podcast, I actually supported illusionism as a theory of consciousness.
but it does sound reasonable, doesn't it?
Yeah, so that's the thing. To me, it actually does sound very reasonable.
Now let's take the next step. What is this summary digest? Mm-hmm. It's brain activity. Mm. It cannot be anything else.
Yes.
Because if you say, well, it's the soul, then you're not an illusionist. If you say it's mental stuff, then you're not an illusionist. Right? Yes. You could say, well, it's not brain activity, it's liver activity. But you still have the same problem that I'm about to tell you. The argument is we don't experience firing neurons because what we experience is a summary digest of firing neurons. But that summary digest can only be firing neurons. There is nothing else it can be. So why doesn't the summary digest itself feel like firing neurons? Oh, because there must be a meta-summary digest. Yes. Yeah, but the meta-summary digest can only be firing neurons. And infinite regress is upon us. Mm-hmm. You cannot escape this. Yes. And people think they can escape this by doing all kinds of linguistic hand-waving. Keith, for instance, the way he defines qualia makes you dizzy. and at some point you realize that there really is nothing there. There is just an attempt by otherwise intelligent people to accommodate their belief system and therefore fooling themselves. Yeah. They need to fool themselves in order to accommodate their own belief system. And they will fool themselves linguistically and through conceptual obscurantism, which is not malicious. Normally, obscurantism is malicious. You do that in order to deceive other people. But there is such a thing as auto-obscurantism, which is something your mind does to safeguard its own belief system. So you will start adding layers of conceptual abstraction, one on top of another, until you can't see the end anymore and say, oh, but there is something there, therefore I can continue to believe that materialism is right.
Do you think you fully grasped Sue's version of illusion or delusionism?
No, it's not illusionism. Because if you look at the conversation, she defined illusionism as the idea that some things we experience are illusions. Well, yeah, it's certainly right, but it's not what Danny Dennett and Keith Frankish make of illusionism, because the problem of illusionism is that it is either incoherent or it is irrelevant. You see, because if it is relevant, then it offers an avenue for solving the hard problem of consciousness. And for it to do that, it has to convince people that consciousness doesn't exist, that it's some kind of illusion, which backfires because an illusion is already an instance of consciousness, but never mind. So for it to be relevant, it has to solve the hard problem, or at least offer an avenue for treating the hard problem.
Or in this case, the illusion problem is what they refer to.
Yeah. So for it to be relevant, it has to do that. But if it does that, it's incoherent. Now, if you don't want it to be incoherent, you have to redefine illusionism in a way that makes it coherent. But then it no longer addresses the hard problem at all, and therefore it's irrelevant. So illusionism is either nonsensical or it is irrelevant. And that's a conundrum. And because of that, he will see true illusionists, not Sue. Sue, based on our conversation, she clearly is not an illusionist in the strict sense of the word.
I mean, I spoke to her last week. Her view is it's more about our delusions about how we approach consciousness and the illusions of how we perceive the word per se, or the way we perceive everything about this concept. So it's more about, so it's
lots of nonsense in there. Yeah, lots of illusions in there.
Yeah.
The problem is that this can be a way to create straw man. I had a direct experience of this. I once wrote an article criticizing the work of a neuroscientist from California, Antonio Damasio, I think. No, yeah, Antonio Damasio, the guy who said consciousness doesn't exist. It doesn't happen. He is on record saying that in an article in New Science, cover feature. And I criticized that. And the way I criticized that was that what he defined as consciousness is not what philosophers call consciousness at all. It's not even what the regular person on the street would call consciousness. He defines consciousness as a kind of immortal soul, a kind of a ghost, a kind of persistent self that inhabits our body. And then he proceeds to dismantle that notion that there is no self, no personal self. All of which I agree. There is no stable personal self. There is no personal self. It's an illusion. The personal self is an illusion. But that's not what we mean by consciousness. What we mean by consciousness is the qualities of experience. And Damasio's argument doesn't even touch that. So I criticized him, and he replied with pure ad hominem, portraying me as some kind of spiritual woo-woo wacko religious fanatic. And I was amazed with that. I mean, I'll confess it drew a smile, because it was an answer to a criticism that in over 800 words didn't at all touch the criticism. It was a non-answer. But it dawned on me that it is the illusionists that are confused about what is meant by the word consciousness. It is they who are thinking of disembodied souls or permanent personal selves. It's they who make that mistake. And now they found a way to refute the mistake they make, but they project that on other people. But the other people are not making that mistake. You see what I mean? Like Danny Dennett, he went to great lengths to dismiss the homunculus idea that consciousness is a little guy sitting inside your head, watching the output of your brain. I mean, that's nonsensical. I mean, congratulations, you refuted something everybody in the world in the 21st century. No, it's untrue. But don't attribute that nonsense to me. Don't attribute it to analytic idealism, and then go and burn the straw man you created. So what dawned on me after that interaction with Damasio was that they are not refuting the confusion of others, the illusionists. They are refuting their own confusion. And they think that they are refuting other people. I don't think that's what's going on here. But, yeah.
What about Galen Strawson and Mysterianism?
Well, Mysterianism, by definition, is not a step forward. It's not a positive step forward in the sense that it's not bringing new clarity. It can be positive in the sense that it at least avoids the bullshit.
Mm.
It avoids the bullshit of saying, oh, consciousness is just brain activity. Well, no, brain activity is probably, it's certainly correlated with consciousness, but the causality here is try to substantiate that for 1.5 centuries and failed. And now we know for sure that it's not there. So at least we avoid that false conclusion by saying, well, we don't know what it is. So there is a negative step forward in the sense that you negate a step backwards, but you don't produce a step forward by saying, well, we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
I think it's too soon to give up, because the problem is not as intractable as it seems. It only seems intractable if one makes some unexamined assumptions that make it intractable. But if you drop those like unexamined assumptions and you clear your head and you approach the problem with a clear, unprejudiced head, it's certainly not as intractable as it would otherwise seem. So I'm not prepared to give up.
Yeah, no, I will.
What was the other thing you said? Mysterianism?
No, I think I just said, yeah, Galen Strawson. I was just mentioning Galen Strawson and Mysterianism. Okay. I'm trying to think, there's no other theory of consciousness. But anyway, chapter 4 is pretty much moving away from the other theories of consciousness, where I wanted to go into depth on analytic idealism itself, discussing how it makes sense of reality without requiring anything other than nature's sole given, which is experience. So I think let's do that.
Can we take a quick bio break? I need to go to the toilet.
Let's do
my bottle. Yeah.
I just realized that would have actually been a perfect opportunity for me to test out some of these bumpers I created. All right. Okay. Yeah. Bernardo. Yeah. So let's go into depth. Let's go in depth into analytic idealism itself, discussing how it makes sense of reality without requiring anything other than nature's sole given, which is experience.
Yeah. So to make sense of nature, we have to grant that there is an external world that we inhabit. If I were in your studio with you right now, I would describe it in a way that would be consistent with your own experience of it. Mm-hmm. So our experiences are not identical, but they are clearly modulated by something outside them, some set of states that we inhabit and which surround us. In other words, solipsism, we cannot, not solipsism, we cannot say that the whole of nature is made of individual mind states. In other words, mind states within people and animals, and avoid postulating an external world. I believe that is impossible. There are attempts to do that are not necessarily incoherent. It tends to go by words like radical constructivism or inactivism. But I believe, and that may be just my being old-fashioned or too stupid to understand some of these approaches, I believe ultimately it will prove impossible to get rid of the external world. Mm-hmm. There has to be external states that we inhabit. But in admitting this, we do not need to make them non-mental. To make them non-mental is equivalent to the following. It's equivalent to be standing on the earth, looking until the horizon, and understanding that everything we see until the horizon is colloquially physical in the sense of contents of perception, but then saying beyond the horizon, it's not planet Earth anymore. Until the horizon, it's planet Earth, but beyond the horizon, I acknowledge there is something beyond the horizon, but it's no longer planet Earth. Mm-hmm. Why? Beyond the horizon, it's just more of the same type of what is in the horizon. In the same way, beyond individual minds, it's more stuff of the same type that individual minds are made of. In other words, mental processes, mental states. They are beyond the horizon. They are not within my individual mind. If I stopped existing, those external mental states would still exist. If every living being would die, those mental states would still exist. They existed before the first living being popped into existence, but they were still intrinsically mental. It's just more Earth beyond the horizon. That's the idea. And with that, you can explain nature as something separate from our individual minds and which is not susceptible to our whims. Our fantasies, our fears will not change what it does because of our morning affirmations. There is still a world out there that is objective from our perspective, but from its own perspective, it is subjective. just like my thoughts are objective to you, but from their own intrinsic perspective, they are subjective. So that's analytic idealism in a nutshell. And the question that remains unanswered is, what creates this inside-outside division? Because to speak of individual minds and a world outside individual minds, you need boundaries that determine the inside of the individual mind. If everything is mental, what mental process accounts for this boundary? Well, the answer is a mental process we have known to exist already for centuries, but we know for sure is a fact of nature for the past 20 years or so, and that's dissociation. Dissociation can literally make you blind to what is right in front of your open eyes, as has been shown in Germany in 2015. So dissociation creates a cognitive boundary within a single mind that leads to the appearance of multiple disconnect centers of awareness. In psychiatry, these different centers of awareness go under the technical name alters, for alternative personalities. Studies by Harvard show that 25% of people with dissociative identity disorder have dreams in which multiple alters partake at the same time. They experience the same dream, each from its own perspective, and they see one another as characters within the dream. They can even club each other over the head, speak to one another, touch one another. And when the person is awake, a person with dissociative identity disorder, depending on the alter that is in executive control of the body, that alter will relate to the therapist the same dream, but from its own point of view, describing the other alters as characters within the dream. And the other alters do the same thing. So the hypothesis is that, okay, there are only mental states. So, you know, the unified field of physics is a field of subjectivity. Excitations of this field of subjectivity are what we call experiences. And within this field, dissociative processes form that create these cognitive boundaries. We know since 2014 that people with dissociative identity disorder, if you put them in a brain scanner, there is something a dissociative process looks like in an fMRI. In other words, dissociative processes have an appearance. They look like something. In the context of nature at large, what dissociation looks like is biology. It's life. Life is the appearance of dissociation. It's what the dissociation in the mind of nature, in the field of subjectivity that is nature, it's what it looks like when it forms. And that's why when you look in the mirror, you see a living being. And when you look at other people who can't read your thoughts and don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda right now, they too are the extrinsic appearance of dissociative processes. And that's why they can't read your thoughts. That's why they don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda, even though they're all part of the same underlying field of subjectivity, the one mind of nature. They cannot access cognitive content beyond their own dissociative boundary. And because of this dissociative boundary, we lose access to the mental states in the world that surround us, which is itself made of mental states. But evolutionarily speaking, it's very important for our survival that we can collect information about the environment around us, negotiate that environment to perceive threats, to perceive food and water. So it stands to reason that we would have evolved to indirectly represent external states as these external states impinge on our dissociative boundary. Because even in a person with dissociation, let's not talk about pathological dissociation now. Let's talk about something that everybody can relate to. We all undergo dissociation all the time. Most of the time, it's not pathological. For instance, if you're having relationship problems with your partner at home, and it's really grieving you, but in the morning, you have to go to work. So what do? We park our problems. That's a way to induce a form of dissociation. When you are at work, you're not experiencing your relationship problems. You're experiencing your work. But that dissociated emotion is impinging indirectly on your work life. It is modulating the tone of your thoughts. You may become more negative, less optimistic. It's modulating your reactions to environmental challenges. For instance, you become more brisk, abrupt, and rude towards people. All that is happening while you're still dissociated from your relationship problems because you've parked them. But the dissociated process is still impinging on your dissociative boundary and modulating what's happening inside. Now, the same thing in nature. When a living being forms, that's the appearance of a dissociative process, but the mental states around that living being are still impinging on that dissociative boundary. And evolution, of course, leveraged that impingement to collect information about what's happening outside, even though, because of dissociation, you are no longer able to directly access external states. And that's what we call perception. Perception is a way to collect the sensory input, the sensor input of the airplane that comes in the form of impingement, and then translate it into an experience that gives you a sort of at a glance view of what's around you. And we may call that vision. Now, what would be the alternative? The alternative is that you're not dissociated, so you're a telepath. Now, if you're a perfect telepath, it would be impossible to survive. Imagine a telepath in the middle of a roused, political-oriented crowd. You'd become completely dysfunctional. So what you need is to have a sort of not direct, at a glance view of what's going on. Yes. So you see people agitated, but you don't get overwhelmed by it. You have a dashboard representation of the mental states that are outside, but you're not directly experiencing those mental states, or that would be the end of your dissociation. So that's what perception is. Perception is the way evolution has found to allow our inner mental states inside the dissociative boundary to be modulated by external mental states that impinge on our dissociative boundary. And what we call the physical world is basically the contents of the screen of perception. And physical quantities, such as meters, coulombs, seconds, these are descriptions of the representations. So the hierarchy you get is that real states are mental states out there, beyond your dissociative boundary. Physical states are inner cognitive representations of these external mental states. And physical quantities are descriptions of these cognitive representations of these inner physical, sort of physical states. So life is what dissociation looks like. Death is the end of dissociation. There is still an external world that you cannot change just by doing your morning affirmations. Otherwise, believe me, my world would have changed already long ago. Science is still valid. Science is a way to model and predict the behavior of the external mental states. It says nothing about what those states are. That's not part of the scientific methodology. It's only part of the methodology of people who are very confused about the difference between science and philosophy. And often they are science spokespeople, people who don't do science, just talk about it. Yeah, that's it.
I mean, that's a wonderfully in-depth summary of it all. I mean, overall, I think that for people who want to listen to this further and find out more about it, they should definitely go watch the Essentia course, because this is definitely a crash course. But I think let's move on to chapter 5, because you've already dived quite deep into analytical idealism at this point. Chapter 5 is, we review empirical evidence from the fields of foundations of physics and neuroscience of consciousness, which seems to directly contradict mainstream physicalism and suggest the validity of analytic idealism.
So one of these things we already touched upon, which is the physical entities do not have standalone reality. They are produced out of an act of measurement. And this is very easy to understand with the dashboard metaphor. If physicality is what appears on the dashboard, if the airplane sensors don't make a measurement, then the dashboard shows nothing. Mm-hmm. Is it so complicated to understand? It's not magical. It's not quantum, oh my God, quantum mysterianism. No, there are no physical entities unless you measure, for exactly the same reason that the dashboard dials show nothing unless the airplane sensors measure. Mm. What we have to abandon is this notion that the external world is the physical world. It isn't. The external world is what is measured. The physical world is the representation of the measurement results on the dashboard. Physical experiments have shown already, unless you believe in egregiously gratuitous and inflationary science fiction, like Evereshian multiverses or the magical, undetermined, hidden variables of of superdeterminism. And unless you're prepared to entertain fantasy, experimental evidence has refuted the standalone existence of physical entities.
Mm-hmm.
And neuroscience of consciousness now has a number of examples that show a inverse correlation between brain activity and the richness and intensity of experience. The most famous one is, of course, psychedelics. Mm-hmm. You have the richest, most intense experience of your life, while the activity of your brain has only reduced with respect to the baseline. But there is more. Pilots undergoing G-force training in centrifuges, they pass out. But when they come round, they report, and I will quote, memorable dreams. In other words, what we take to be unconsciousness is just unresponsiveness. Mm-hmm. Those people are not unconscious at all. They are experiencing memorable dreams. Mm-hmm. Or another example, acquired savant syndrome. People who suffer accidents or a shot in the head or suffer head trauma, they suddenly become capable of incredible mathematical feats, or they start composing music like professional composers, even though they had no training, or they become exquisite artists. So that's another instance of impaired brain function leading to broader consciousness. Or Vietnam War veterans, that's a study from 2016. War veterans, more than 100 of them were studied. Damage to specific parts of the brain is correlated with a much higher propensity to so-called spiritual or religious insight. Mm-hmm. A more prospective study was done in Italy in 2010, in which people who were to undergo operations for the removal of brain tumors, they were studied for an index called self-transcendence, your ability to identify to something bigger than yourself. They were scored for that before and after surgery. And after surgery, which always causes damage in surrounding cerebral tissue, spiritual self-transcendence, the index of self-transcendence is much higher. So people have a broader, deeper experience of life, despite impairment of brain function. Or even trivial things, Tevin, like choking. Yes. Teenagers worldwide have figured out, and this is a very dangerous thing, that partial strangulation can give you a psychedelic trip. You can go to other dimensions, speak to alien beings, unfathomable experience just by partial strangulation. Of course, some of them die because turned out they actually get strangulated. But strangulation, which reduces blood flow to the brain and therefore reduces metabolism, a generalized reduction of brain metabolism, leads to much richer and intenser experience. Mm-hmm. I could go on and on and on, but this shows that experience is not caused by brain activity, because there are cases in which brain activity reduces and experience increases, and both happen in significant amounts, significant degrees. So what this shows us is that brain activity is what inner experience looks like. And unlike the cause of a phenomenon, the appearance of a phenomenon doesn't need to be complete. It doesn't need to tell everything there is to know about the phenomenon. For instance, I see an appearance of you right now, but I can't see what's underneath your skin. I don't know what's on your back. I can't see the details of your metabolism. Your appearance correlates with what you are, your conscious inner life, but it doesn't tell me everything there is to know about that. In the exact same way, brain activity correlates with your conscious inner life, but doesn't tell you everything there is to know about conscious inner life. If it were a cause, it would need to. There cannot be anything to a phenomenon but what you can trace back to its causes. But an appearance doesn't need to be complete, and that's why in all these instances you have experience that cannot be traced back to brain activity.
I mean, you've given so many different neuroscience of consciousness examples there. I mean, I'm definitely not going to say, or be one of those guys who's going to say, I'll find each paper and put the link down below. Anyone listening and watching just
I have done that already. Because although you are not one of those guys, there are many of those guys out there.
So finding, I'm talking about for the audience, if they want to find those links, they're just going to have to Google it and research it on their own.
Oh, if you go to which chapter was it? Chapter 5?
It's chapter 5, yes. So if you go to all the links.
Yeah, you go to the description of that video, and it's
Perfect.
not all, because there are just too many, but it's a couple of dozen there.
I'll
At
definitely
some
have.
point, I thought this should be enough for the worst skeptic at this point.
Okay, no, then I'll definitely have that link ready for them. Within that, something I thought about while you were talking, Bernardo, was because part of it was the fields of foundations of physics. Well, I don't think we touched on this, but what do you think about Penrose's and Stuart Hameroff's quantum consciousness theory?
I don't think it. I think it was a valid attempt, but I don't think it pans out.
Is it?
No, but Penrose's objective collapse. I think it looks at things the wrong way. And now I'm in extremely dangerous territory, because I'm about to criticize a physics Nobel Prize winner.
Yes.
But sometimes physicists get sidetracked by wrong or unexamined philosophical assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And for those, I am a bit of an authority. So what I'm about to say, I say with humble humility towards Penrose, because I have profound admiration for him, more than respect. But we are all humans. Nobody gets it perfect. So, and I'm too committed to truth to not say what I feel needs to be said, just because of my extraordinary respect for Sir Roger. I don't think there is such a thing as collapse. I think collapse is a merely operational concept that allows us to operationalize experiments and talk about them, but it doesn't reflect an actual element of reality. I don't think anything collapses in reality. And therefore, objective collapse is an illusion, because there isn't collapse to begin with. And I think Sir Roger started from the assumption of collapse, because operationally, it's useful. You know, you have a quantum system in a superposition. If you touch it, it will decohere and collapse. So that's what we experience doing science. So I understand the tendency to try to take it for a fact, an objective event. I don't think it is. I don't think if you have specialist viewers, they will now raise all kinds of questions. So I should at least continue a little bit more, at least to give an impression to people that I have thought about it. Maybe I didn't give you a complete answer, but I have thought about that. Decoherence is not collapse. What we take to be collapse is merely decoherence. But decoherence is such a marked effect that we think collapse really exists. So what do I think is happening? What is decoherence? Let's start like that. Okay, if you have a microscopic quantum system in a superposition, that superposition has information. When you touch that quantum system with a classical apparatus, the information in the superposition will sort of leak into the classical environment. In other words, you can no longer see the superposition. But the superposition is not lost. That information didn't go away. It just became diluted in the classical environment the moment you touched the quantum system. So nothing collapses. The superposition still exists in the broader classical environment, but you can't perceive it for the same reason that you cannot perceive a drop of ink in the ocean. When you drop ink in the ocean, the droplet didn't disappear. It didn't collapse out of existence. The information in the droplet, in its molecules, properties of its molecules, it's still there. It's just diluted and dispersed in a much broader context. So that's decoherence. You lose your ability to see the information in the superpositions. If you run an interference experiment, you will not see an interference anymore, because it's now diluted in the classical context. What decoherence does not tell you is how the classical context became classical to begin with. Because the whole thing is based on this notion that, okay, the laboratory equipment and the laboratory itself is classical. But if everything is quantum, how did that become classical to begin with? That's where we need to review our understanding of foundations of physics. But the point I'm trying to make for now is that what passes for collapse is merely decoherence. Nothing truly collapses. The question we need to answer is how things appear classical to begin with.
Okay, interesting. I wanted to ask you about this, but I was considering just moving on to the next one, but I was going to ask about the last one regarding superdeterminism.
Oh yeah, I had a debate with Sabine Hossenfelder a while ago. How do I describe that without coming across in a way that I don't want to?
I think I read your paper on about it already.
I can repeat some of the criticisms I made of superdeterminism towards Sabine. If you link the video, then people can go back, or I wrote about it as well.
You wrote about
it. People can see the details. Yeah, but in a nutshell, what superdeterminism tries to account for is the measurement problem. For instance, the correlations between Bob's measurements and Alice's measurements. Even though Alice and Bob cannot communicate, and the particles were already in flight for a while, so the particles couldn't communicate with one another either. Superdeterminism tries to address that by saying that the statistical character of an individual quantum measurement, which cannot be determined. When you make a single quantum measurement, the outcome is random. All you can determine is a law of large numbers. If you make enough measurements, then we know the statistic distribution of the results. But for individual results, they are random. In other words, they violate determinism. What superdeterminism says is that no, there is no violation of determinism. We just cannot predict the outcome of a single measurement because there are variables involved that we don't measure, that we know nothing about. And it's those hidden variables that actually determine everything. And that's then extrapolated to account for the whole of quantum mechanics and preserve notions such as physical entities do have standalone existence. And the correlations between Alice and Bob's measurements is just because these hidden variables are not spatially located. So they provide a kind of instantaneous transmission of information that causes the correlations. What these, if you elaborate, if you go a little bit deeper into this general idea and try to explore what it means in practice, what you get is the following. I will use a metaphor, but the metaphor really corresponds to the technicality of the thing. What is being postulated here is the following. If you were, suppose you are an astronomic photographer and you want to make a picture of the moon at night. So you take your camera out to your backyard, you put it on a tripod, you point it at the moon, and then you will program the parameters of the camera, such as exposure, exposure time, and aperture. What superdeterminism says is that what the moon is depends on the settings of your camera. So if you change the exposure, you change the aperture, the moon will change. The settings of your experimental apparatus determines what the thing that you measure is. How does it do that? Hidden variables. We don't know. But that's what it does. And why is this interesting in order to preserve materialism? For the following reason. If you believe that your camera settings change the moon itself, then whatever your photo shows will be consistent with your theory. Because the photo that comes out is no longer an objective representation of the thing measured. It is now a representation of your experimental settings. Nothing is objective anymore. Everything depends on experimental settings because your experimental settings will change what things are via these hidden causal chains. Worse yet, even if you postulate a theoretical entity such as hidden variables that have not been shown yet to exist, for which there is no evidence, even in that case, the minimum that is expected from a decent scientist is to specify what it is that you're postulating to exist. Not to just say hidden variables, but no, tell me something more.
Yes.
More or less, what is it supposed to be? You know, where am I supposed to find it? What would be the physical parameters under which I could expect to measure them or to find them? Give me something. To give you a concrete example, when Higgs predicted the Higgs boson in the 60s, Peter Higgs, there was zero evidence for the Higgs boson, but he told us what was the expected energy level. He told us what it was expected to decay into, so we could know what to find. He told us the circumstances and parameters and conditions under which we could expect to produce it. He gave us the ranges of different physical properties of the Higgs boson. No evidence for it, but he told us what the Higgs boson was supposed to be. If you postulate a theoretical entity, at the very least, you have to specify what it's supposed to be so people can look for it. And sure enough, we went looking for it and we found it. By the way, we found it within the range that Peter Higgs predicted. Yeah. It was not bang in the middle of it. It was a little higher on the energy level, but it was within range. This is science. Yes. But Sabine, she doesn't even begin to tell you what it's supposed to be. So how does she define hidden variables? Well, hidden variables are whatever is necessary to be in nature such that I can continue to believe in materialism and determinism. That's not science. And during the debate, she told me, no, she did determine the hidden variables. She even referred to a paper. And I believed her. I thought, well, then I failed in my homework. She determined it somewhere. Turned out that she just, well, I'll just say it. She just lied to my bloody face. And it was an outright lie because I went to the paper she mentioned. And there is no such a thing down there. The paper was a toy model of hidden variables, which was never meant to apply to reality. It was a mathematical exercise so they could train about writing the equations. Path integrals. Sabine's path integral for superdeterminism has a term called quantumness, which is supposed to be minimized. And it's like, come on, I mean, this isn't theory, this isn't science, this is hand waving. And in the very paper she referred to, the first author of the paper, who was not her, he says at the end, this is just a toy exercise. The hidden variables we are specifying here cannot exist in reality because we are violating several things we know to apply in reality. So it is so far, it may change. Somebody may specify coherently some hidden variables and give us ranges and give us something that we can work with. But right now, it's a kind of unfalsifiable religion. It's something that is defined in terms of which what you want, in terms of what you want to believe nature to be, or how you want nature to behave. So you don't say what the hidden variable is, you just say there is something that does whatever needs to be done so I can continue to believe what I believe. Yeah. This isn't science. I get you. It borders on the unethical, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, at least it has a cool name, superdeterminism. I mean, it's a pretty nice name. I think let's move on to chapter 6, Bernardo. So in this chapter, we're going to discuss the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and meta-consciousness, arguing the so-called unconscious reflects merely a lack of the latter, not the former.
So phenomenal consciousness is present when there is experience. I'll give you an example. Right now, everybody listening to this is experiencing their breathing. They are experiencing the air going into the lung, the dilation of the rib cage. They are experiencing the air flowing through their nostrils. But right before I said it, they didn't know that they were experiencing their breathing. They were not telling themselves in their minds, oh, I'm now breathing. This can happen also with subtle forms of pain, especially with men. Men can be in pain for days. It has happened to me. And only realize after days that, oh, I've been feeling this pain for a while. So I was experiencing pain, but I couldn't report on my pain even to myself. I was experiencing my breathing, but I was not reporting on my breathing even to myself. So phenomenal consciousness requires the experience, the pain, the breathing, but not the report of the experience. When an experience is accompanied by the internal report, I am now having this experience. That's now meta-consciousness or conscious metacognition. That's your ability to introspectively assess the contents of your own mind and then describe them for yourself. Now, we know these two things are separate at the very least. I mean, arguably, we have known this forever because it's very reasonable. And in the annals of philosophy, we have people talking about it without using the name. Nietzsche talked explicitly about the distinction between consciousness and meta-consciousness. So did Schopenhauer. So did Kierkegaard. So there's history about that, but technically, we've known since at least 2002 that there is this distinction. When Jonathan Schooler published a paper in which he showed that not only these two things are separate, they can even differ. You can have one experience and report on something else. There are dissociations between consciousness and meta-consciousness, which is the title of the paper, Dissociations Between Consciousness and Meta-Consciousness. What often people talk about when they say consciousness, what they mean is meta-consciousness. It's the experiences that not only we have, stuff that we not only experience, but that we know that we are experiencing them. In other words, it requires this higher level mental function called re-representation. An experience is already a representation. If you see a balloon in the sky, that balloon you perceive is an inner cognitive representation of external states of affairs. But when you tell yourself, I am experiencing a balloon now, you re-represent that inner cognitive representation, such that the re-representation points to the representation and say, that is happening. This re-representation is a higher level mental function that perhaps only humans have, and if other animals have, only higher animals, pachyderms, cetaceans, other higher primates. But it's not there in earthworms. Probably it's not there in a cat. A cat's not going around saying, I feel hungry now. I have the experience of hunger. The difference between consciousness and meta-consciousness is the difference between I am hunger and I feel hungry. Because when you are not meta-conscious, the experience is all there is. There isn't the subject who is having the experience. There is only the experience. So you are the hunger. But when you say, I am experiencing hunger right now, that's meta-consciousness right there. And humans are so big in this meta-consciousness business that we mistake it for raw consciousness itself.
Yes. At some point, I mean, what are your thoughts? Because I remember the last time we spoke about how David Chalmers perfectly framed the hard problem of consciousness for everyone, because that's the first step to getting a solution to a problem. It's framing it correctly. And then now we obviously know he started the meta problem of consciousness. What were your thoughts when he came out with that infamous new line?
The meta problem of consciousness is why about 30% of people do not see the hard problem of consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll talk about this just to conclude my previous thought, because I didn't connect it back to the storyline. The important thing about making this distinction between consciousness and meta-consciousness is that when we talk about unconscious states, we may actually be talking about non-meta-conscious states. Under idealism, everything is a conscious state or a mental state. So there is no such a thing as unconsciousness. So how do we account for this nominally unconscious states? Well, we can account for them in two ways. One is they're not unconscious, they're just not meta-conscious. And the other one is they're not unconscious, they're just not accessible to the reporting ego because of internal dissociative processes, inner dissociation. That's why we talk about unconsciousness. It's not that there are actual states that are not conscious. It's just that those states are not accessible due to lack of metacognition or lack of associative links. They're not accessible to reportability, even self-reportability. Now, the meta problem of consciousness is the problem of why a certain percentage of people do not see the hard problem of consciousness. Why they do not recognize its existence. The hard problem of consciousness is the following. There is nothing about physical parameters in terms of which we could, in principle, deduce the qualities of experience. In other words, there's nothing about the configuration or disposition of subatomic particles and fields in your brain in terms of which we could deduce, in principle, what it feels like to eat an apple, or to have a bellyache, or to experience disappointment. There is no link between the two. And I already gave you an explanation for why there is no link between the two. It's physical parameters are descriptions. They are the map. But when you try to put the descriptions prior to the thing described, the lines in the map lose their meaning. They mean nothing. And if they mean nothing, of course, you cannot account for the qualities of experience or deduce the qualities of experience from a map that means nothing. Mm-hmm. It's very clear. Now, the problem is, why do some people not understand this? Some people think that there is no hard problem of consciousness, that it's perfectly reasonable that the physical parameters of your brain as a material object lead to conscious experience. I have theories about this. There are different reasons why some people don't recognize it. I think the leading reason is that they do not understand what physicalism means or entails. They do not understand physicalism. And that's something that I discovered by personal interactions with friends of mine who are very technically capable, very erudite people, not philosophers, engineers, scientists. They do not understand physicalism. I had a friend a couple of years ago here in my backyard, and we were having a beer in my backyard. And at some point, I sort of, got lost in my own thought, and I made a comment out loud, which was basically an inner thought. I said, "Look at this garden. I have several trees in my backyard and lots of plants. Under physicalism, all of this is inside your head." Why did I say that? Because under physicalism, the qualities of perception are created by your brain inside your head. The green of my garden is inside your head. Oh yeah, there is stuff out there in my garden, but it has no qualities. It's a set of mathematical equations floating in a vacuum. It's the best way you can visualize that. All the qualities that I associate with my garden, they are supposed to be produced by my brain inside my skull. So my garden, as I perceive, is supposed to exist inside my head, which is absurd. And I made that comment. And my friend jumped. He has a doctorate in computer science. He jumped and said, "What nonsense. Physicalism says no such a thing. Of course your garden is out there." And then it dawned on me that many people who identify as physicalists do not understand physicalism. Yeah. They think that the only thing that is inside your head are endogenous experiences like thoughts, fantasies, emotions. But that perceptual experience is really out there. No, that's not physicalism. Physicalism says that perceptual experiences too are inside your head.
Is that naive realism there?
Yeah, it's a form of naive realism. So I think it's my suspicion that many people who do not recognize the hard problem fail to do so because they do not understand physicalism. If they truly understood physicalism, they would have to acknowledge that there is an impassable bridge between quantities and qualities.
Bernardo, anything else you want to touch on between that distinction between phenomenal and meta consciousness and the unconscious relation?
Good to go. Good to go.
Good to go. Okay. So the closing part of this crash course on analytic idealism, we respond to any objections that you found most appealing, most convincing, close to convincing you otherwise. And then obviously you can leave us with some personal reflections about idealism in life.
Many of the objections are based on a misunderstanding of idealism. For instance, some time ago, Sam Harris was at the Lex Friedman podcast, and he was asked a question about idealism. And I will paraphrase his answer. I don't remember the words exactly, but his answer was like, the notion that all of this out there, the cosmos, is in my mind, is obviously nonsensical. And I was appalled by that, because here's someone who brandishes a degree in philosophy from Stanford University,
Mm.
and idealism is part of the ABC 1, 2, 3 canon of philosophy, and he didn't know what idealism is. It's farcical, almost. If that's your misunderstanding of idealism, then as per your misunderstanding, idealism is not true. But the idealism you're talking about is your own delusion about what it means. It's not a real idealism.
Yes.
So most of the criticisms are based on these kinds of misunderstandings, and they can come from people even who brandish a philosophy degree from Stanford University. Ignorance suffixed by the letters Ph.D. is the worst form of ignorance, because it's plausibly believable.
Yes.
Other criticisms are based on assumptions that people make without knowing that they are making them. For instance, a criticism that I often hear from very highly educated people is the following: Bernardo, if I have a needle and I stick it in your arm, that physical process of a needle piercing your skin will cause the mental process called pain, and you will withdraw your arm. So here we go, a direct arrow of causation from a physical process to a mental process. Ergo, mental processes are not fundamental, and idealism is not true. Now, do you see the straw man here? Under idealism, there are no non-mental processes.
Yeah.
Under idealism, that needle piercing your skin is a dashboard representation of a mental process. A mental process that impinges so strongly on your dissociative boundary that it directly modulates inner states within the dissociative boundary. We call that pain. But the whole thing is mental.
Yes.
The needle or the glass of alcohol that you drink, those are dashboard representations of transpersonal mental processes that impinge or even pierce your dissociative boundary. So the error of causation is not from physical to mental, it's from mental to mental. And that mental processes causally affect other mental processes of a different type is trivial. Your thoughts modulate your emotions every day. You have a bad thought, look how you feel. Or if you're feeling bad, pay attention to your thoughts. Your emotions causally modulate your thoughts every day. Mental processes causally impinge on other mental processes. This is trivial. There is nothing extraordinary about it. So that needle causing pain is just an instance of that, a transpersonal mental process piercing through your dissociative boundary and causally impacting your inner mental processes. We call that pain.
Yes.
Or you could call that something positive in the case of a caress. But that hand caressing your skin, that too is the dashboard representation of a mental process that is impinging on your dissociative boundary. Finally, there is a deeper type of criticism that I already talked about, which is based on this notion that under idealism, there is only one field of subjectivity. That's how we avoid the combination problem. We start from something that is already universal. And now all you have to explain is the appearance of separation, which, lo and behold, is very easy to do because we have an empirically established phenomenon in nature called dissociation that does exactly that. So we escape all of these discussions about the conceivability of a hypothesis. Forget conceivability, it's an empirical reality. Whether you can coherently conceive of it or not, it's your problem. Don't mix epistemology with ontology. Dissociation exists, whether we understand it or not. But you still have this one field of subjectivity, and a frequent criticism against it is this notion that we are compound organisms made of parts, made of cells. Therefore, our consciousness must be compound. It cannot be just one dissociative process in a big unity. It has to be something that forms from parts. But I already discussed the fallacy here is to think of human beings as assembled as opposed to grown.
Yeah. Tell me, did you touch on, I'm trying to think if you did touch on the difference between solipsism and idealism. Did you touch on that?
There is a lot of confusion out there with this word solipsism. So the strict definition of solipsism is the view that you are the only conscious entity that exists, and that everything in the world, in the universe, is your own dream.
Yes.
That the other people you see, they are figments of your imagination. There is nothing it's like to be other people. There is only something it is like to be you seeing other people. In other words, other people are just shells with no ghost inside. They don't have their own conscious perspective. They're just images you produce in your own dreaming mind. Solipsism is a non-starter. It's not something that can be discussed, because if you are a believer in solipsism and you're consistent with it, you're never going to defend it.
Yes.
You're never going to talk about it, because you're just talking to yourself.
Do you find yourself arguing with solipsists often?
A true solipsist will not argue. What's his name? Alan Watts. He made a joke once. Imagine a conference of solipsists. Each one of them thinks that everybody else is an illusion. Why would they go to the conference?
Wonderful.
Why would you defend solipsism to someone else? This other person is supposed to be a figment of your own imagination. Who are you talking to? So there is no debate around solipsism. And Bertrand Russell, in the early 20th century, he said, people who maintain to believe in solipsism actually act in contradiction to that professed belief. They don't act consistently with that professed belief. In other words, they aren't really solipsists. Now, you see, solipsism is unfalsifiable, because every evidence pro or against solipsism is construed by the solipsist as a figment of their own imagination. But it is not the most reasonable explanation. And I'm not going to get into why. There is a line of argument that shows you that solipsism is not the most reasonable explanation. And it has to do with observing in other people behavior that is caused by emotions or experiences that you haven't yet had. So therefore, you could not have imagined them. And therefore, solipsism is not the best explanation. But that's, strictly speaking, solipsism. And it's completely different from idealism. A solipsist would say other people are not conscious. They only exist as shells that I imagine. An idealist would say other people are dissociative processes in the mind of nature. There is something it is like to be them. They have their own conscious point of view too. A solipsist would say there are no external states of the world. This is all my personal dream. They are all inner states. An idealist, an objective idealist, would say, no, there is really an external world out there that is not in my mind. But that external world is also mental. It's not in my mind, but it's mental. Just like your thoughts are mental, but they are not in my mind. They are external to me. So yeah, there's a glaring, spectacular differences between solipsism and idealism. Things get confused when people use the term solipsism in a non-rigorous manner. I have a friend, for instance, who talks about cosmic solipsism. He says, no, there is really just one mind, and it's dreaming this whole thing up. And I am it, but you are it too. And that's non-dualism. That's Eastern non-dualism. And this is idealism, indeed. But it's not solipsism, strictly speaking. Cosmic solipsism is idealism. Why will we use two words instead of one? Just call it idealism. And by calling it cosmic solipsism, you create confusion with the strict definition of solipsism.
Yes.
So I steer away from it. I disclaim everything that has the word solipsism, because acquiescing to it is conducive to confusion.
Yeah, and I think they're already and I do think they're already so closely associated, in the sense that people mistake the two views, that you should actually do that. It's a good way to avoid that. Any other objections, Bernardo, or do you think you've covered them all?
Oh, certainly not.
All the main ones, at least, the ones that are slightly convincing.
Yeah, the ones that came to my mind the quickest, I have covered them.
Okay, no, great. So then I think the closing part's obviously, I know you're not a mystic. I know you're not someone who's very spiritual. You're not very spiritually inclined. You don't like giving that type of advice or opinions on it, but your closing personal reflections on idealism and life in general. And then we can conclude this crash course on analytic idealism.
Idealism is the most self-evident, obvious, intuitive, natural, and empirically adequate worldview that we could have. And we just took a wrong path because of socio-political reasons in the early Enlightenment. We started believing our own snake oil. There was a reason for coming up with this fiction of materialism at that time. It was a socio-political reason. And then we started mistaking our own fantasies, socio-political tools for realities. And this has brought us where we are. And you might say, well, it's been a long time. No, less than 2 centuries. It's nothing. It's the blink of an eye in the cultural history of humanity. We will overcome this. We put our foot in the wrong place. We will overcome. We'll bring our feet back to the path, and we'll continue to go forward. And it will be a historical blip. Mm-hmm. That's all there will be to physicalism in the future. So don't think for a moment that because physicalism is mainstream, that this and of itself makes it extraordinarily plausible. Mm-hmm. Because throughout human history, the mainstream has always been wrong. At least throughout Western history, the mainstream has always been wrong. We have absolutely no reason to think that miracle upon miracle right now, for the first time, it will be right. It will not. It is not. Mm-hmm. The plausibility of physicalism is a cultural artifact. It has been manufactured by people who are born and are told that physicalism is true from their school teachers, their parents, their family doctors, and the 8 o'clock news anchor. And they think, I don't need to think about these metaphysical questions because all these people who were alive before I was even born, they already did the thinking for me. They arrived at this conclusion. And this conclusion apparently bases all science. So it must be true. And people like Bernardo Kastrup, they're just taking too much psychedelics, right? Too many drugs. I haven't taken psychedelics in years now, but it's very easy to come at this conclusion and very tempting because it's the lazy conclusion. Mm. It's the conclusion that doesn't put the responsibility on your shoulder to be critical about your own beliefs. In that sense, it's attractive like a religion. It gives you the answers without asking you to do any of the hard work. Now, in the second half of life, this comes back to bite you because believing in it becomes then a personal habit, and it's very difficult to part from it once it has become a personal habit. And in the second half of life, it's a terrible thing to believe in because it gives you the picture that the universe is dead and life has absolutely no meaning. That if everything you learn, all of your hard-earned lessons, the product of the suffering you had to undergo throughout life, all of those are supposed to be physical brain states that lose their coherence once you die, and therefore it's all for bloody nothing. All for nothing. You don't think that when you're 28. But when you're 48, you start, oh, shit, no, all this shit, and it's for nothing. And then the way to get out of this completely unnecessary dilemma that leads to depression and anxiety is to review assumptions. But now those assumptions have become a lifelong habit. And it's very difficult to even see them, let alone revise them. But if you can revise them, if you can value your own individuality, your critical individuality as a worthy opponent to mainstream stories, if you have enough trust in yourself to trust your rationality to an equal extent as the story is outside, you can demolish this artificial source of depression and anxiety and realize that what there is mind, and life is a configuration of mind. That configuration ends. Your body disappears. You're no longer dissociated. But everything you learn through this terrible roller coaster that we call life, which is exquisitely prone to suffering and pain, everything you learned, all of your maturation process, all of your edification process as a suffering human being, it doesn't disappear because at the end of the dissociation, the boundary is over. Therefore, the mental contents of that dissociative process are now seeded in a much broader cognitive context. They are now seeded into nature at large. And it wasn't all for nothing. If you can get to this point, you will not suffer a day of existential depression in your life anymore. What you will suffer again from is a kind of death anxiety that our ancestors knew very well, but we don't. What we fear is oblivion, which is a kind of existential anxiety.
Yes.
But we no longer fear what we will experience after the end of life, the great unknown, because we think we are not going to be there to experience it. So we are not fearful at all about the state of consciousness that comes after life. Well, that's the bad news. That anxiety comes back. If your listeners have gone through an experience of ego dissolution through psychedelics, that's a sample of what might be coming. And there is some degree of dread about it. You know, you're going to exit the state of consciousness that you've experienced your whole life, which is where you feel comfortable. It's your safety zone. It's that state of consciousness where you can repress the stuff you don't want to feel, you don't want to know. And with the end of that state of consciousness we call life, you may not be able to repress any of this shit anymore.
Yeah.
and then what? Yeah. So your life will be very meaningful again. Meaning will be permeating every single aspect of your life, whether you want it or not. Whatever you do or don't in your life, it will still be immersed in meaning, and you cannot avoid it. But shit, when the time comes, you may pee in your pants again. And
I think
because I am afraid of that transition.
I know you're making me quite afraid right now. I mean, I'm feeling, you know, for someone who claims to not be a spiritual storyteller or mystic, that was quite mystical, I must say.
Well, if we equate mysticism with being human, with dealing with what it means to be human, such as our sense of meaning and our anxieties, then everything is
no, that's what I meant.
right?
That is what I meant. Yeah. I didn't mean mystical.
I'm not spiritual in the sense of some external deity that is interfering with states of affairs in nature according to some premeditated plan. No, I'm not. I don't think that that applies. No.
I think we're both the same in that regard. Bernardo, thank you so much. I mean, this was pretty cool. I was figuring out how we could do this, and I think this was the perfect approach. How are you feeling? Anything you want to add to that? Anything you want to say? Final thoughts?
Passed pretty quickly.
Exactly. I mean, I looked at the time and I was actually quite surprised. But how are you feeling? Everything, you feel like you've got everything off your chest, or is a good crash course? You're right.
Yeah, I think we covered good ground. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bernardo, for joining me again. I mean, I'll try and think outside the box for the next one.
Sure. Thanks for having me again. It's been a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Cheers, Bernardo. Thank you so much. Crash course done.
Take care, man.